Okay, so I'm going to do an audio lecture for racializing the glass escalator so we can catch up so that we're not behind anymore. Okay, so under this glass escalator model, this idea that men in predominantly female positions are typically moved up versus the kind of, glass ceiling argument we were talking about before. So, first of all, to understand this, we have to understand that jobs are sex segregated, which creates different occupational experiences. So most of our jobs are segregated by gender. We often have differing experiences of our jobs depending on our gender and whether or not we are in an industry where our gender is over or underrepresented, that's going to affect our experience. So in female-dominated positions, men may be perceived as unfit for these jobs that often require feminine traits such as nurturing, caring, and empathy. But under this glass escalator model, the argument is that men are often perceived as more competent than women, even in female-dominated fields. So they often experience easier entry into higher status or higher pay positions, which is what they call the glass escalator. So most research looking at the glass ceiling assumed a white male experience, and when they were talking about the glass escalator, the same kind of thing. So it would amalgamate the differences that people actually experience in work with what the experience is for white men. So the author of this research suspected that black men would not necessarily have the same work experiences or experiences of the glass escalator as white men did. So really, again, this kind of comes back to the intersection of race and gender. So conclusions that we make have to be based on the experiences of all people, not just on white men, because the experiences of white men tend to overlook the ways that race and gender create different experiences for different men. So the theoretical framework that the author used for this research was, this understanding of tokens. So this concept that, if you look at the glass escalator, but with an intersectional lens, interested in the particular experiences of black men nurses, you might see something different than what they were seeing happening for, white male nurses. Okay, so first we have to kind of explain what is token, like what are tokens? So tokens are people that are seen as different from the majority. They're typically highly visible as they are different from the majority in that career field. So they're often stereotyped by those in the majority group. And they can often feel pressure to behave in ways that challenge and undermine those stereotypes. So like I said, they're highly visible because their red is different from the majority. So male tokens in female-dominated careers often find that their conspicuousness can lead to greater opportunities for leadership and choice assignments as they stand out instead of blending in. So it can be a positive situation in this particular form to be a token. But male tokens in female fields do not experience a lot of the same things that female tokens experience in male-dominated career fields, such as isolation, lack of visibility, blocked access to social networks, stereotypes, those kind of things. Often men's difference in these situations in a female-dominated career can facilitate opportunities and advancement. So specifically, they were looking at a lot of research that looked at male nurses and how even though nursing is so highly gendered to be a female profession, men tend to be escorted into these kind of higher positions in this glass escalator model. Men in predominantly female positions have different experiences than women in predominantly male positions, right? So those women often face harassment or the assumption that they're not able to work at the same level as men. And so, this research was looking at the experiences of minority men. So specifically, this idea that you can't really just apply the experience of white men to all men. So experiences of black and white tokens may be different in that they reflect their different positions in the hierarchies of status and power. So, the researchers really wanted to examine whether or not the glass escalator is experienced among all men in an identical manner. And they talked about this idea that, men's advantage is built into the structure of everyday interactions. So even in culturally feminized occupations, men's advantage is built into the structure of these interactions of these jobs so that men find themselves actually struggling to remain in place. They can often feel an invisible pressure to move up the work ladder. So there's a certain, mechanisms that cause this advantage, including certain behaviors and attitudes that enhance men's position in female fields, such as beliefs that, men bring something to these occupations that women don't, as well as the types of interactions they have with their coworkers and their supervisors. So, they went into this idea a lot within the research study, this idea that your relationship with your female coworkers and your male supervisors is going to be one key aspect of how that glass escalator works. So basically, a lot of men that this research was based on, again, white men, experienced, these warm collegial welcomes from their female colleagues, which again is very different from those experiences of women that are in largely male professions, who experience a lot of isolation or lack mentorship, and are often blocked access to social networks that, that kind of can lead to career advancement. So men in predominantly female fields often have male supervisors, even though the majority of the people at their same job position are female. Their supervisors tend to be male. So that can help them bond in a mostly female field because of their gender, right? So you can kind of build a relationship based on the fact that you're the same in some way. So this often helps facilitate raises or better positions, producing this glass escalator effect. So that friendships that come from this gendered situation often pay off for men as occupational advancement. When they're talking about this glass escalator framework for their own research, they first kind of went through this assumed generalizability to all men. So, most of the glass escalator research assumes that all men experience this privilege in the same way, but neglect to see if race affects this phenomenon, treating men as a monolithic category. But we know race often affects perceptions of gender or class or sexuality, etc., that we have to look at these in an intersectional way to understand how they influence each other. So, these black male nurses may face different perceptions than the white male nurses when it comes to patient interactions, staff and coworker interactions, supervisor interactions, really those things that result in those different experiences of the glass escalator. What they found in the research was that for black men nurses, gender racism can affect the extent to which they bond with their coworkers and bosses, which results in, which the goal result is promotion and raises from those relationships. So gender racism, these racial stereotypes and images and beliefs that are grounded in gendered ideas, can produce this gendered racist stereotypes of black men that emphasize them as dangerous or threatening, or give them certain attributes that are associated with black masculinity that frame black men as threats to white women, prone to criminal behavior, especially violent, all of these kind of things. So, these racist stereotypes of black men, they go into a whole thing of, the research of Patricia Hill Collins within the reading, talking about how these stereotypes serve to legitimize unequal treatment, right, across different sectors of society, right? Of course, Collins was speaking more so in the way of criminal justice system through methods such as racial profiling, mass incarceration, blah, blah. But also, in the context of this research, they were looking at how this may hinder black men's attempts to enter and advance in various occupational fields. So for these black male nurses, these gendered racist images may have particular consequences for their relationship with their female coworkers, who may view them through the lens of these gendered racist stereotypes that emphasize danger that they're assumed to pose to women. There also are these perceptions that men in general do not belong in nursing. So while all men in nursing face this perception that they should not be a nurse, depending on the race, they really kind of have different assumptions that are attached to that. So white men nurses are often mistaken for doctors or higher status positions than nurses. So again, this has to do with that gendered assumption that men are more competent than women. They should have jobs higher up, which reflects that kind of supremacy. But race affects this perception. So black male nurses are subjects to racial stereotypes that believe black people are inherently less competent than white people. Despite their education, experience, and skills, many people still assume that people of color belong in lower level service work. So there's this unspoken racialization. So this blackness and the resulting stereotypes that assume incompetence may mitigate that male privilege of assumed competence that comes with masculinity. So another mechanism of the glass escalator involves establishing distance from women and the femininity associated with their occupation, meaning that male nurses often develop strategies to dissociate themselves from the feminine part to retain some of the privilege associated with masculinity which places men in a prime position to experience the glass escalator effect. So again, they kind of go through this, defining what hegemonic masculinity is so that understand it for the context of the article, that there's certain qualities that we associate with these dominant assumptive ideas about masculinity that we place on men, such as ideals of toughness, strength, aggressiveness, heterosexuality, and a clear sense that masculinity is distinct from and better than femininity. So really, this is a way that someone can maintain their privilege and status while they ride the glass escalator. So by distancing themselves from femininity, they reinforce that these are two mutually exclusive categories and that one should be, more privileged than the other. So for Black men, this desire to reject femininity may be compounded by racial inequality. So some have argued that this institutional racism we have in our culture blocks access to traditional markers of masculinity. So if Black men effectively reject femininity, they may reassert their masculinity to gain status. More often, though, Black male nurses may reject femininity or exclude themselves from coworkers, more so because they experience racial discrimination that makes raises and promotions inaccessible, less so because of a gendered strategy. So, some argue that these racialized men can challenge racism by rejecting hegemonic masculinity because it implicitly assumes whiteness by its definition, right? There's a couple of examples in there, for Asian American men and how they're challenging these stereotypes in your reading, but, basically kind of repudiating this cultural standard of hegemonic masculinity. So some men may embrace femininity to combat racism. So by showing female qualities, Black male nurses may be able to combat stereotypes of Black masculinity. So in their research findings, first they looked at the reception that people got from their colleagues and supervisors. So first they found that Black men do not experience the warm reception with their coworkers or supervisors that white men do. So they talked about coworkers that treated them coldly or excluded these men from shared spaces. So these experiences were very different than those faced by white men who could choose to segregate themselves but were not systematically excluded by their female coworkers. So the author is really arguing there that this pervasiveness of gendered racist images that emphasize white women's vulnerability to dangerous Black men can play a role in these coworkers' perceptions and choices to exclude these men, right? Like one of the examples was the guy walks into the break room to have his break and everyone gets up and walks out, right? Like that's a kind of extreme version of exclusion. The next thing they looked at were these perceptions of suitability. So like their white male counterparts, they were often perceived by patients to not be a nurse because again, men are not commonly in the field. 9 out of 10 nurses are females, so of course men are going to kind of experience this backlash within the role. But as we talked about a moment ago, white men were often assumed to be doctors or higher ups, which again can accelerate the glass escalator, as patients are often assuming this person is a doctor or a higher status position that can kind of influence people to actually make them into higher status positions, right? But this was not the case for Black men in this study, who were often assumed to be janitors or service workers, right? So rarely do Black male nurses get mistaken for doctors. Sadly, they're often assumed to be service workers or janitors, not nurses or doctors, showing how this racialized effect skews perceptions of male nurses. So some participants talked about the lengths they went to in order to present themselves in a way they hoped would give them legitimacy. Like there was the one man that talked about, wearing his white uniform and making sure it was pressed and perfect to kind of display physically that he was a nurse, which again didn't really mitigate the kind of racist treatment that he faced. So they talk about this effect that in their findings as being, these men are basically simultaneously raced and gendered. So it's a very intersectional process, as is this confluence of these two identities that create very different experiences of the glass escalator. So they described experiences that reproduced Black men as better suited for blue-collar or unskilled labor than for nursing or being a doctor or higher position. So there was also a lot of men in the study that refused to reject femininity. So Black men actually embraced some of the more feminized attributes linked to nursing. So a few of the participants talked about how much they valued and enjoyed being caring and nurturing in their jobs. And they spoke openly of caring as something positive and enjoyable, like a reason that they liked doing their job. And really interestingly, they found that, a lot of these same men that refused to reject femininity were specifically fighting these effects of racial inequality. So their caring motivated them to use their positions as nurses to help others and address racial health disparities, especially those in disproportionately affect Black men. So they would talk about how, that was a positive thing that they found within their job, was being able to help people that had been marginalized or that they understood issues within the African American community when it came to like health issues that were being largely unaddressed. So they felt like their position was giving them a way to kind of counteract a lot of this larger racial inequality.